A billionaire's brand new $85 million private jet sat dead on the tarmac for 6 days. Hundreds of the world's best aviation engineers couldn't figure out why. Then a delivery man in a worn jacket walked into that hangar and fixed it in under 4 minutes. What happened next stunned everyone in that building. If you want to know how a single father with grease on his hands outthought an army of experts, stay with me until the very end. Like this video, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Mercium, Part 1. The morning Logan Pierce backed his truck into the service entrance of Hargrove Regional Aviation Center, he was thinking about Sophia's lunch. Not about avionics, not about money, about whether he'd packed enough of those little cheese crackers she liked, or if she'd spend her afternoon at the school cafeteria pretending she wasn't hungry so she wouldn't have to ask her teacher for a meal ticket. Sophia was 7 and already too proud for her age, which meant Logan worried about that specific kind of quiet dignity she carried, the kind that comes from watching a parent stretch $40 across a week of groceries without making it look like work. He'd packed the crackers. He was almost sure of it. The truck needed new shocks. Every pothole in the service road sent a dull thud up through the cab, and the cargo, 2 sealed crates of replacement avionics components for a Cessna Citation that had come in 2 days ago, shifted with each jolt. Logan kept one hand relaxed on the wheel and the other resting on the window frame. It was February, cold enough that his breath showed, but he kept the window down anyway because the heater ran too hot and made him sleepy on long drives. The Hargrove Center was a mid-sized regional aviation hub about 40 miles from Cloverfield, where Logan ran his shop. He did delivery runs twice a week, sometimes 3 times when business picked up, and the route was familiar enough that he barely thought about it anymore. Pull in at the service gate, check in with whoever was working the desk, unload, get the signature, go home. Simple. He wasn't supposed to be distracted by anything. But as he turned around the back edge of Hangar B, following the service lane toward the smaller maintenance bay where he was headed, something in his peripheral vision made him slow the truck almost without deciding to. He pressed the brake. Looked. The main hangar, Hangar A, the large one with the retractable roof panels, was wide open. That by itself wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the density of people inside it. Even from 50 yards out, Logan could count at least 30 figures moving around or standing in clusters near the nose of an aircraft he'd never seen parked here before. It wasn't a Citation. It wasn't a small regional turboprop. It was a Gulfstream G900, and not a used one. The paint was still too perfect, the winglet accents still too bright. The tail number was partially obscured by a rolling scaffold, but the livery was unmistakable even from a distance. Sterling Aero. Logan had heard the name. Everyone even loosely connected to the aviation industry had heard it in the past 2 weeks. Vanessa Sterling's company had just unveiled its flagship corporate transport service, a fleet of ultra-long-range jets designed to compete at the very top of the luxury market, hand-assembled, fitted with a proprietary avionics suite that Sterling Aero had spent 4 years developing in-house. The announcement had been everywhere. Trade journals, general business press, one of those glossy magazine profiles with a full-page photo of Vanessa Sterling herself, standing on an airport tarmac in a blazer, with her arms crossed, looking like someone who had never in her life been uncertain about anything. The crown jewel of the fleet, the jet designated Sterling 1, was supposed to have departed on its inaugural transatlantic demonstration flight 11 days ago. It had not departed. Logan had read about that too, though briefly, because he didn't usually follow corporate news with any real attention. Something about a startup failure. The engines wouldn't sequence. The aircraft simply would not power up past a certain stage, and no one could explain it. The story had moved fast through aviation forums and industry circles, the kind of quiet, slightly gratified chatter that ran through trades whenever a flashy new player stumbled publicly. Sterling Aero had reportedly flown in specialists, then more specialists. Logan had seen one post that claimed 40 engineers had been on site before the end of the first week. He'd glanced at the post, registered it distantly, and kept scrolling. Now he was looking at the actual aircraft. He sat in his truck for a moment longer than he should have, engine idling, watching the figures move in and around the hangar. Even at this distance, the body language told a story. Too much standing around, too many people with clipboards staring at tablets. The particular posture of professionals who had been working a problem for a long time and were no longer sure they were making progress. He recognized that posture. He'd worn it himself years ago, hunched over a repair bench at 2 a.m. with a cold coffee going stale beside him. A horn tapped behind him. He looked in the rearview mirror. A fuel service vehicle was waiting for him to move. Logan pulled the truck forward, found the service bay, parked. He sat for one more second before killing the engine. Not your problem, he told himself. He got out of the truck. Mab. The sign-in desk inside the maintenance bay was staffed by a young man named Derek, who always had something playing through one earbud and always pretended he didn't when Logan came in. Today, it appeared to be something with a heavy bass line. Derek pulled the earbud out when Logan dropped the delivery manifest on the counter. Pierce, you're early. Road was clear. Both crates? Both crates. Serial numbers on the manifest. Derek checked the sheet against a clipboard of his own, did the thing where he tapped the pen against his teeth for a moment, then signed. Logan tucked his copy of the manifest into his jacket pocket. What's going on in the big hangar? Logan asked. Derek didn't look up from whatever he was writing. Sterling thing? Still? Day 6. Derek set his pen down. They brought in a third wave yesterday. Some German outfit, apparently the best avionics diagnostics team in Europe. And? Derek made a face. Same as the last 2 waves. They run the startup sequence, it gets to the third initialization stage, and then… He snapped his fingers. Nothing. Like the aircraft just decides it doesn't want to turn on. Logan nodded slowly. They try a cold reboot of the primary avionics bus? Derek looked at him the way people usually looked at Logan when he asked a question like that. A look that acknowledged the question was technically intelligent, but also communicated the slight surprise that Logan was the one asking it. Logan was used to that look. He was a delivery driver and a small shop repair tech. He wore a jacket with a fraying left cuff. People made assessments. I have no idea what they tried, Derek said. I just know they haven't fixed it. Logan thanked him and went back out to unload the crates. He used the hand truck, made 2 trips, got everything logged and stacked in the maintenance bay. He should have gotten back in his truck. The day had a shape to it. A second delivery on the other end of the county, then back to Cloverfield in time to pick up Sophia by 3:30. He was running about 12 minutes ahead of schedule, which was a comfortable margin, not a blank check. He walked back to the truck. He walked past the truck. He wasn't entirely sure why. He told himself later that it was the angle, that from the service lane there was a clear sight line through Hangar A's open side door, and something about what he could see just made him keep walking. That was probably true. It was also true that Logan Pierce had not been able to walk past an aircraft problem since he was 11 years old, sitting cross-legged on a concrete floor next to his father, watching a man who could identify a malfunctioning component by sound, alone, explain why everything had a logic to it if you were willing to hold still and listen. He stopped at the door of Hangar A. There was a young woman in a safety vest near the entrance managing a clipboard and a radio. She looked up at him. Deliveries are next building over. I know, Logan said. I already dropped off. Just looking? She wasn't hostile, just busy. She turned back to her clipboard. Logan looked at the aircraft. Up close, it was genuinely impressive. Not in the showy way of a sports car or a luxury object designed purely to signal expense, but in the engineering way. Someone had thought very carefully about the integration between the airframe and the new avionics housing. The cowlings were fitted differently than anything Logan had seen on a production aircraft. The conduit routing along the fuselage was cleaner than it had any right to be. This wasn't a gimmick. Whatever Vanessa Sterling had built here, she'd built it with people who actually cared what was inside. Near the nose, a cluster of 6 or 7 men and 1 woman stood around a tablet mounted on a small rolling stand. They were talking, but from the door Logan couldn't make out words. One of the men, older, broad-shouldered, wearing an earpiece, was shaking his head slowly in the specific way of someone explaining, for what was clearly not the first time, why something wasn't working. Logan's eyes moved to the auxiliary power unit access panel, which was open on the starboard side. A technician was inside it, running a diagnostic wand over the connections. Logan watched him work for a moment, Then his eyes moved to the diagnostic terminal on a rolling cart near the starboard wing root. The screen was angled slightly toward him, just enough. He wasn't close enough to read the data clearly, but he was close enough to see the structure of it, the initialization log, the sequence tree, the pattern of what had fired and what had failed. His father had taught him to read those logs the way some men learn to read weather or water, not by memorizing a manual, but by understanding the language underneath the data, the way one stage's failure spoke to the one before it. Logan looked at the log for maybe 45 seconds. Then he felt something shift behind his sternum, that specific, almost unwelcome certainty he'd felt maybe a dozen times in his life, standing over some piece of equipment that wasn't working when it should be. He knew what was wrong, or he was almost sure he did. Sure enough that the not sure part was just noise. He stood there for another moment. The smart thing, the easy thing, was to turn around and walk to his truck. He had 12 minutes of schedule cushion. He had a daughter who liked cheese crackers. He had a business that survived on its reputation for being quiet and reliable and not overstepping. He had absolutely no standing in this hangar. He went in anyway. So, the woman with the clipboard and the radio said, "Sir, I think I see your problem," Logan said, not stopping. She said something else. He heard it but was already moving toward the cluster of engineers near the nose. One of them, a younger guy, maybe 28, with the slightly sunburned look of someone who'd been under a lot of hangar lighting for many consecutive days, noticed Logan first and went on alert in the way people do when they spot someone who isn't supposed to be somewhere. "This area is restricted to the initialization log on your starboard diagnostic terminal," Logan said, gesturing toward the cart. "Can I look at it up close?" The older man with the earpiece turned around. His name tag read Grady. He had the look of someone who had run out of patience several days ago and was now operating on something grimmer. He looked at Logan, the jacket, the fraying cuff, the fact that he clearly wasn't carrying the ID badge that everyone else in this hangar was wearing. And his expression settled into the particular flatness of a man who was done with wasted time. "Who are you?" Grady said. "Logan Pierce. I run a repair shop in Cloverfield. I made a delivery to the bay next door." A pause. "You made a delivery," Grady repeated. "Yes. And you walked in here because I looked at your diagnostic log from the door, and I think I know what the problem is." The cluster had gone quiet. 6 engineers looking at the man in the fraying jacket. Someone at the back of the group made a small sound that might have been a laugh, or might have been something that was trying to be professional enough not to be a laugh. Grady clasped his hands together in front of him. "Mr. Pierce, we have 31 engineers from 4 countries who have been working on this aircraft for 6 days. We have access to Sterling Aero's complete technical documentation, the manufacturer's full diagnostic suite, and 2 external specialists who between them have a combined 90 years of experience in high-end avionics systems. So, with respect, your initialization is failing at the 3rd stage handoff," Logan said. "You've been diagnosing it as a hardware fault, something in the engine sequencing or the power distribution. You've probably replaced at least 3 components, maybe more." Grady said nothing. "But the aircraft is turning on fine. See, everything's running correctly up to stage 3. Then it stops. And it stops in a clean way. No fault code, no sensor alarm, just a refusal. Which means the hardware is fine." Logan paused. "It's a software problem, something in the startup initialization chain. A file, probably. Something that isn't executing the way it should." The silence in the hangar had changed texture. The young, sunburned engineer wasn't smiling anymore. Grady studied Logan for a long moment. His expression was unreadable. "That's a general characterization that could describe several failure modes." "I know. I'd need to see the full log up close to be specific." Logan met his eyes. 5 minutes. If I'm wrong, I'll leave and you can go back to what you were doing." He might not have gotten the 5 minutes. He might have been walked out by security, which Logan would have accepted as the reasonable outcome of an unreasonable thing he'd done. But at that moment, the side door of the hangar opened and Vanessa Sterling walked in. He recognized her, obviously. The photo from the magazine spread wasn't entirely accurate, or rather, it captured her correctly, but removed the particular energy she moved with, which was not the composed authority of a person accustomed to being photographed, but something faster and more restless. She was 30 years old, and she walked like someone who had learned to move quickly through spaces where people expected her to move slowly. She had a slight build, dark hair pulled back with the deliberate carelessness of someone who had more important things to care about than her hair, and she was wearing a blazer over a flannel shirt in a combination that shouldn't have worked and did. Behind her was a man with a phone, and a woman with a much larger phone, and someone else who appeared to exist solely to keep pace with her. She crossed the hangar floor toward Grady and didn't look at Logan at all, which was not a slight. She simply hadn't processed that he existed yet. "Tell me something has changed," she said to Grady. Grady's jaw moved. "We've eliminated the secondary power distribution as a contributing factor. That's not changed. That's eliminated. I need changed." She pressed her fingers to the bridge of her nose for a moment. "The press release goes out in 48 hours, regardless of whether this aircraft is running. I need something to put in it besides 'we're still working on it.'" "Ms. Sterling," said the sunburned engineer, and then he stopped. Vanessa looked at him. "What?" He glanced at Logan. She looked at Logan for the first time. Her eyes moved across him the same way Grady's had. Quick, assessing, landing on the same data points. The jacket, the fraying cuff, the absence of a badge. "Who is this?" she said. "His name is Logan Pierce," Grady said. "He drove a delivery truck to the adjacent bay and then walked in here saying he knows what's wrong with the aircraft." Vanessa looked at Logan. Not dismissive, not amused, just very direct. "Do you work in avionics?" "I run a small avionics repair shop, and I did a delivery here this morning." "A delivery?" "Yes." She looked at the diagnostic cart, looked back at him. "What do you think is wrong?" "I'd rather look at the full log before I say specifically, but I think it's a corrupted or misconfigured initialization file somewhere in the avionics startup sequence, something that looks correct in a surface scan but isn't executing properly." "We've run full diagnostic sweeps," Grady said, not directing it at Vanessa, directing it at the air between them. "A diagnostic sweep looks for files that are missing or flagged as corrupted," Logan said. "It doesn't always catch a file that exists and reads as intact, but has bad data in a non-critical field that only matters when the startup sequence tries to reference it." Silence. Vanessa Sterling was looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite classify. It wasn't belief exactly. It wasn't disbelief either. It was the expression of someone who had been operating on a set of assumptions for 6 days and was now encountering something that didn't fit the assumptions, and was deciding whether to update the model or reject the input. 5 minutes, she said finally. Grady turned toward her. "Vanessa." 5 minutes, James." She didn't look at Grady. "What do we lose?" He got the 5 minutes. They rolled the diagnostic cart to a position where Logan could stand at the terminal without having to reach past anyone, and they stood back. Not far, but enough. Grady stood with his arms crossed. The sunburned engineer stood with his hands in his pockets. Vanessa stood slightly apart from all of them, and she watched Logan the way she probably watched everything, with complete attention and no particular expression to telegraph what she was thinking. Logan looked at the log. The full log was longer and denser than the portion he'd seen from the door, but the structure was exactly what he'd thought. He scrolled through the initialization sequence. Stage 1, clean. Stage 2, clean, all subsystems handshaking correctly. Stage 3. He slowed down here, reading carefully. The handoff from Stage 2 to Stage 3 was a standard process in any avionics startup. The primary flight management system acknowledging the avionics suite's readiness signal and giving clearance for the engine sequence to begin. In most aircraft, this was a simple binary, ready or not ready. In the G900's proprietary system, Sterling Aero had built a more complex handshake protocol that included a 3-part verification, which was, Logan thought, actually smart engineering, thorough. But it meant there were 3 places where the process could quietly fail instead of 1. He found it in the second verification step. Not a missing file, not a corrupted file, not as any standard diagnostic would define corruption. It was a parameter. A single value in the initialization reference file that told the verification protocol what the expected timing window was for the stage 2 handshake signal. The value was wrong, not wildly wrong, not wrong enough to fail an integrity check. Wrong by a margin that only mattered at the exact moment when the sequence tried to match the actual incoming signal against the expected signal. Every time the aircraft tried to start, Stage 2 completed correctly and sent its signal on time. And then the Stage 3 verification checked the timing against the reference file and found a mismatch of a few milliseconds. And then, silently, with no fault code, with no alarm, with no indication of why, Stage 3 refused to proceed. Logan straightened up. He was aware that everyone in the hangar was watching him, and he put that awareness in a separate compartment and left it there. "There's a timing parameter in the Stage 3 initialization reference file," he said. "The expected signal window is set to a value that doesn't match the actual Stage 2 handshake timing. The handshake is executing correctly. It's the reference file that's wrong." He paused. "It's probably a transcription error from when the file was built. Someone typed a value wrong, or it got corrupted in a very specific way that standard diagnostics don't flag because the file itself reads as intact." Grady had uncrossed his arms. "Where exactly?" he said, and there was nothing in his voice now except the question. Logan pointed to the screen. "There. That parameter. That value should be—" He stopped. He didn't actually know what the correct value should be. He knew the format, he understood the protocol, but he didn't have Sterling Aero's technical specifications memorized. You'd need to pull the build documentation and check what the specification calls for. But if it says what I think it says, that's your problem. Grady leaned in and looked at the screen for a long time. He said nothing for almost 30 seconds. Then he turned to the sunburned engineer and said, "Pull the spec sheet for the Stage 3 initialization reference, right now." The engineer was already moving. Vanessa Sterling was still watching Logan. "How did you see that from the door?" she said. "I didn't see it from the door," Logan said. "From the door I saw the pattern of the failure. You lose Stage 3 in a clean way every time, no variance, which means the hardware is executing correctly and something in the logic chain is refusing it consistently." That pointed toward a reference file issue. The specific file, he gestured at the terminal. That took the 5 minutes. She held his gaze. "You said you run a small avionics shop." "In Cloverfield." "Cloverfield." She said it the way people say a place they don't know exists. "And before that?" Logan looked at the aircraft instead of at her. "I learned from my father. He was a military avionics specialist. Retired early, taught me everything he knew." He paused. "He passed away 3 years ago." Vanessa said nothing for a moment. "I'm sorry," she said. And it didn't sound like the reflexive thing people say. It sounded like she actually meant it, which Logan hadn't expected. "Thank you," he said. Across the hangar, the sunburned engineer was back at a second terminal, pulling up a document on a tablet. Grady crossed to him. Logan watched them from a distance, watched Grady lean over and read something on the tablet, watched his posture change in a very specific way. Grady straightened up. He turned and looked across the hangar at Logan. His expression had shifted. "The specification," Grady said, raising his voice slightly, "calls for a window of 400 milliseconds." He held up the tablet. "The value in the reference file is set to 280. Nobody moved. Logan didn't feel triumphant exactly. He felt what he always felt when something clicked into place. A kind of clean, quiet resolution, like a room going still after a long noise. He'd felt it the first time as a kid, crouched next to his father over a training aircraft at the base. And his father had handed him a probe and said, "Tell me what you hear in this system." And Logan had held still and listened, and then said something, some small observation. And his father had looked at him with an expression Logan had spent the rest of his life trying to earn again. "That's your problem," Logan said. They let him fix it. Not immediately. There was a conversation first, a tense one, conducted in low voices near the starboard wing while Vanessa's team debated. Grady was professional about it. Logan had to give him that. He didn't fight it out of ego. He asked Logan specific questions about the correction process, about rollback procedures, about whether modifying the initialization file would affect any other parameters in the startup chain. Logan answered all of them. One of the German engineers, A compact, precise man named Kessler, who had barely spoken during the whole exchange, interjected twice with very specific technical questions that Logan answered in enough detail that Kessler's expression changed from neutral skepticism to a different kind of neutral that was doing more work. Vanessa stood slightly apart from all of it and listened. She didn't ask questions. She was reading the room, Logan thought. Reading him, reading her own people, calculating something he couldn't see the shape of. Finally, she said, "Let him do it." Grady didn't protest. He nodded once, tightly. They sat Logan at the terminal. He pulled up the reference file, found the parameter. It was right where he'd seen it. He verified again that it was the only incorrect value in the relevant section. He checked the surrounding parameters as a precaution, because his father had taught him never to fix one thing without looking at what lived next to it. Then he changed the value. 400 milliseconds, the correct value per specification. One small number replacing another small number. He backed out of the file, saved it, restored the system to its standby state. He pushed the chair back and looked at Grady. "Run the startup sequence," Logan said. Grady nodded to the technician at the aircraft. The hangar went very quiet. For a moment, nothing happened. Logan heard the sound of his own breathing, and behind that, very faintly, the sound of February wind pushing against the hangar's roof panels. Then stage 1 fired. Then stage 2. Then stage 3 came alive. Not in the old way, not the silent refusal, but cleanly, audibly, the verification completing and passing, and the signal propagating forward through the sequence. And then the engines of Sterling 1 began to spool. It started low, almost below hearing, a vibration more than a sound. Then it climbed, rising in pitch and in power, filling the hangar with the particular thunder of something large and precisely engineered waking up properly for the first time. The sound hit Logan in the chest, not unpleasantly. It never was unpleasant. That sound had been the background of his childhood. Around him, the hangar had erupted, not in celebration, exactly. The engineers were too professional for that, and most of them were already moving, checking readouts, verifying, doing their jobs. But the quality of the movement had changed. The posture of 6 days of grinding failure had transformed into something lighter, faster, purposeful. Kessler, the German engineer, looked at Logan. He gave a single nod. Logan nodded back. He stood up from the terminal. He needed to call the other delivery and let them know he'd be running late. He needed to text Sophia's school and make sure the aftercare pickup was confirmed. He needed to go. He looked at the engines, still spooling, still climbing. "Listen," his father had said once, holding up one finger, standing in the middle of a noisy maintenance hangar the size of an aircraft carrier bay. "The machine will tell you everything. You just have to hold still." Logan had held still. He picked up his jacket from where he draped it over a cart, put it on, and walked toward the door. He was 10 feet from the exit when Vanessa Sterling said, from somewhere behind him, "Mr. Pierce." He stopped. He turned around. She was standing in the middle of the hangar floor, her team clustered behind her at a distance, the engines of her aircraft still singing. She looked at him with that direct, unreadable expression she'd worn since the moment she'd noticed he existed. "You're just going to leave," she said. "I have deliveries," Logan said, "and I need to pick up my daughter at 3:30. Something moved across her face. Not quite a smile. Close. "The $1 million, she said. "I heard about that," Logan said. "It's yours." He looked at her. He looked at the aircraft. He thought about his father, who had died with about $11,000 in savings and a shop full of hand tools, and a collection of handwritten technical notebooks that Logan had kept and still read, and which were the reason he'd spotted what 31 engineers from 4 countries had missed. He thought about Sophia's lunch. He thought about the expression on his father's face, not the last time Logan had seen him, which was in a hospital bed and wasn't a memory he visited often, but the earlier one, the one in the hangar, the single nod that meant, "Yes, that's right, you heard it." Logan put his hands in the pockets of his jacket. "I need to think about that," he said. Then he walked out into the February cold, got in his truck, and drove to make his next delivery. Behind him, Sterling 1's engines climbed to their rated thrust, filling the morning with sound. He was 12 minutes late picking up Sophia. Not a disaster, The aftercare teacher, Ms. Hensley, was still there, and Sophia was still in the room, sitting at one of the small tables with a worksheet she'd already finished, her backpack on her lap, her coat already zipped. She looked up when Logan came through the door, and her expression did the thing it always did. Started neutral. Moved through something that was clearly relief, but that she was too proud to let fully land on her face, and settled into a version of 7-year-old composure that Logan found both endearing and quietly heartbreaking. "You're late," she said. "I know. I'm sorry." Ms. Hensley said you probably just got stuck in traffic. Logan glanced at Ms. Hensley, who gave him the small diplomatic smile of a woman who covered for parents regularly. "Something like that," he said. Sophia slid off the chair and took his hand without being asked, which she only did when she'd been more worried than she wanted to admit. They walked to the truck in the early evening cold, and Logan buckled her in and started the engine, and Sophia looked out the window at the parking lot with the particular silence of a child who has decided to wait and see. "Did something happen?" she asked when they turned onto the main road. "Something a little unusual, yeah." "Good unusual or bad unusual?" Logan thought about it. "I genuinely don't know yet." Sophia considered this with the seriousness she applied to most things. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Did you eat lunch?" He hadn't. He'd forgotten entirely. "I had some crackers," he said, which was technically true because there'd been a sleeve of crackers in the truck's glove compartment since sometime in November. Sophia looked at him sideways. "Dad?" "I know." She turned back to the window. She didn't push it, which was one of the things about Sophia. She said the thing once clearly, and then she let it be. She'd gotten that from her mother, Logan had always thought. Or maybe from watching Logan try and fail to say things once, and clearly his entire life. Either way, it was a better quality than he'd managed at 7. They stopped at the diner on Route 9 because Logan hadn't planned dinner, and Sophia asked for the grilled cheese without being told they couldn't afford anything fancier, which she always did, and which always made something in Logan's chest feel like a bruise. He told her a version of the day's story while they waited for the food. Simplified, without the technical details, just the shape of it. A big airplane that wasn't working. A lot of engineers who couldn't figure out why. Him walking in and looking at it. Sophia ate half her grilled cheese listening, then set it down and looked at him the way she sometimes did, with an attention that felt too old for her face. "And you fixed it?" "I found what was wrong. Other people ran the actual fix." "But you found it?" "Yeah." "And Grandpa taught you how?" "A lot of what I know, yeah. Him and years of working on it myself." Sophia picked up the other half of her sandwich. "He would have liked that," she said, simple and certain, and went back to eating. Logan sat with that for a while. He ordered a coffee he didn't need just to have something to do with his hands. He didn't sleep well that night. It wasn't anxiety exactly. More like the feeling of standing at the edge of something and not being entirely sure what the something was. The $1 million kept turning over in his mind not as a number, but as a shape. As a problem. He told Vanessa Sterling he needed to think about it, which had been honest. He did need to think about it. He just didn't know yet what he was thinking toward. He sat on the edge of his bed at 1 a.m. with his father's notebook open in his lap. The notebooks were spiral-bound, cheap, the kind you bought in bulk at office supply stores, but they were filled end-to-end with his father's handwriting, precise, cramped, occasionally annotated with small diagrams that looked rough at first glance, and were completely accurate on close reading. There were 16 of them. Logan had read all of them multiple times. He kept going back to them not because he needed to. Most of the information was either already in his head or superseded by newer technology, but because reading them felt like a conversation. One-sided, but still. He found the section he remembered near the middle of Volume 7. His father had written it the year before he retired, during a period when he'd been involved in training programs at the base. There was a paragraph that started with something about knowledge transfer, about the particular problem of expertise that lives inside one person's head and dies with them. "The problem isn't that people won't share what they know," his father had written. "It's that sharing feels like losing. Like if I teach you this, I'm less than I was. But that's backwards. Knowledge shared doesn't diminish, it multiplies. The thing I show you goes further than I ever could on my own." Logan sat with that for a while. He closed the notebook. He thought about the $1 million. He thought about the kids in Cloverfield, not as an abstraction, but as specific faces. His neighbor Marcus's son Deshaun, who was 16 and had started hanging around Logan's shop after school last year, asking good questions, learning to use the diagnostic equipment, showing exactly the kind of patient, observant attention that Logan had recognized immediately because it was the same quality his father had recognized in him. Deshaun's mother worked 2 jobs. Deshaun had a state assessment coming up that could earn him some scholarship money if he passed. But the prep class cost $400, and the family didn't have $400 sitting somewhere. Logan thought about other kids like Deshaun. There were a lot of them. Aviation was not an industry that recruited from Cloverfield. It recruited from places with money, with connections, with families who knew someone who knew someone. The technical knowledge existed to train anyone. The field wasn't intrinsically closed. But the pathways in were narrow and expensive, and you had to know they existed first. He put the notebook back on its shelf. He went to make a cup of coffee he wasn't going to drink. He knew, by then, what he was thinking toward. He'd probably known since the diner, since Sophia said, he would have liked that in the simple, certain voice of someone who'd never learned to make things complicated. The question now was whether Vanessa Sterling was the kind of person who would listen. She called him the next morning at 7:42. He was in the shop, opening up, unlocking the front, running the morning diagnostic on the bench equipment, starting a pot of coffee on the small maker in the back corner that had been running low-grade terrible coffee since 2019 and which Logan had neither replaced nor reconciled himself to. He heard his phone, saw the number, and answered it. "Mr. Pierce?" Her voice was direct, businesslike, but not cold. "Vanessa Sterling. Good morning. I wanted to reach you before you had the opportunity to talk yourself out of the money." Logan almost laughed. "Is that what you thought I was doing yesterday?" "I thought you were doing one of several possible things, and that was the most likely one." A brief pause. "The other possibility was that you already had a specific use for it that wasn't yourself, and you hadn't decided if you trusted me enough to say so." He set down the diagnostic probe he was holding. "That's a pretty accurate read of a 5-minute conversation. I've been building a company since I was 24. I've had to get good at reading people fast." Her tone shifted slightly. Still direct, but something else underneath it. "I also looked you up last night. Your father, specifically. Warren Pierce. I read a few things about his work." Logan was quiet for a moment. "Okay." He trained 87 technicians over his career. That's according to an interview he gave to an aviation trade journal in 2019, a year before he passed. He said, she paused, and Logan had the impression she was reading from something. He said the thing he was most proud of wasn't any specific repair or any specific aircraft. It was the number of people he'd passed the knowledge on to. Logan's hand tightened slightly on the phone. 87, he said. 87. He hadn't known the exact number. His father had never talked about it that way, never quantified it. He'd just kept teaching, kept passing things on, the same way he'd breathed, without announcing it as a virtue. "Mr. Pierce," Vanessa said, "I'd like to meet. Today, if that's possible. Not about the money, about whatever it is you actually want to say." She came to the shop. He'd offered to drive to wherever she was. A hotel, her plane, an office. He assumed she had all of these, but she'd said the shop, and that was that. She arrived at 10:15 in a car that was expensive but not ostentatiously so, driven by a man who waited outside without being asked. She came in alone. The shop was not a place designed to impress anyone. It was functional, organized, well-maintained in the practical sense, which meant everything was exactly where it needed to be, and none of it was new. The front counter had a crack in the laminate from when Logan had dropped a torque wrench on it in 2021. The walls had his license, his certifications, a bulletin board with delivery schedules and parts orders, and a framed photograph of his father standing in front of a C-130 somewhere in the desert, squinting into the sun, not smiling because his father didn't smile for photographs, but looking entirely at ease. Vanessa looked at the photograph for a moment. She didn't say anything about it. She set her jacket over the back of the customer chair and sat in the chair itself. which was an old office chair that leaned slightly to the left if you didn't compensate for it, and she compensated for it without appearing to notice. "Talk," she said. So Logan talked. He'd spent part of the night organizing what he wanted to say into something coherent, and now that he was saying it, he was aware of how rough the shape of it still was. Not a plan exactly, more like a direction. He talked about Deshawn, though not by name. He talked about the structural problem, the way aviation as an industry had no real pipeline from working-class communities, the way the knowledge existed to train anyone with the aptitude and the patience, but the access was gated by money and geography and connections none of those kids had. He talked about his father's notebooks. He talked about what it had meant growing up to have someone take the time to explain not just what to do, but why. To treat the understanding as the point rather than the compliance. He was aware, as he talked, that it was coming out imperfect, circular in places, losing the thread once or twice, not the clean articulate pitch that someone like Vanessa Sterling probably received from people who'd spent weeks preparing it. He kept going anyway. When he finished, the shop was quiet except for the refrigerated parts cabinet cycling on. Vanessa had her hands folded in her lap and was looking at the middle distance somewhere to his left. "You want to use the money to start an aviation training program?" she said. "For kids who can't afford the standard pathways in." "Yes." "Based out of here?" "Based here eventually, maybe. I'd need facilities I don't have. I'm not saying I have the whole structure figured out. I know the need. I know what the education would look like. The infrastructure is, He stopped. "It's a gap." Vanessa was quiet for a moment. "The $1 million won't cover it. Not long term." "I know. Programs like this need recurring funding, administrative structure, partnership with certification bodies." She said it without inflection, not discouraging him, not enthusiastic either, just naming the reality. "I know," Logan said again, "but it covers the start, and the start matters. If there's nothing, you can't build on nothing." She looked at him. "What you're describing is a workforce pipeline investment. The aviation industry has a significant shortage of qualified technicians. It's been getting worse for 10 years. An argument could be made that funding this makes economic sense for the industry, not just charitable sense." "I'm not trying to make it make economic sense. I know you're not, but I am." She uncrossed her ankles, shifted slightly in the chair that leaned. "I have a board of directors. I have investors. The way I move money, especially large amounts of money, has to survive conversations I have with people who care primarily about return on investment." She paused. "But if the argument can be made that this investment builds the technician workforce the industry needs, and it can be made because it's true, then I have more room to work with than if it's purely philanthropic." Logan looked at her. "You're saying you do more than the $1 million. "I'm saying I'm thinking." She said it precisely. "Don't turn that into a commitment I haven't made yet." He nodded. "Fair enough." She looked around the shop again, slowly, taking it in with the same thorough attention she'd brought to the diagnostic terminal the day before. Her eyes moved across the equipment, the certifications on the wall, the parts storage system, his father's photograph. "Yesterday," she said, "I was standing in that hangar trying to figure out if you were a crank or not. Someone who'd convinced himself he could see something 31 engineers missed, because that kind of person exists and they always have a very confident explanation for everything." "What made you give me the 5 minutes?" She thought about it. "Two things. The first was that your explanation was specific. Cranks are usually vague. You said timing parameter. You said initialization reference file. You said stage 3 handshake. That's not the vocabulary of someone pattern matching to a thing they read once." "And the second thing?" Her expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but something near it. "The second thing was that you weren't trying to convince me. Most people in that position, walking into a room they have no right to be in, trying to get a billionaire to listen to them about something technical, they oversell. They get louder when they sense resistance." She paused. "You just said what you thought was true and then waited. You weren't performing. That was unusual." Logan didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. Vanessa picked up her jacket from the back of the chair. "I need a few days. I need to talk to some people. I need to see numbers." She stood. "Can I reach you at this number?" "Yes." "And your daughter?" She said it without preamble. "How old?" Logan blinked. 7? What's her name? Sophia. Vanessa nodded once, like she was recording it. She walked to the door. She had her hand on the frame when she turned back. My father built the first version of Sterling Arrow in a rented garage with money he borrowed from my grandmother, she said. He died when I was 19 and he never saw what it became. She looked at Logan's father's photograph one more time. I understand what you're trying to do. Then she walked out. Logan stood in the middle of his shop for a while after her car was gone. He thought about calling his accountant, and then remembered his accountant was a part-time bookkeeper named Phil, who worked out of an office above a dry cleaner and handled 4 other small businesses besides Logan's. And what Logan would really need, if any of this became real, was an actual accountant, the kind who understood nonprofit structures and grant frameworks and the tax implications of $1 million donation. He didn't call Phil. He made a cup of the terrible coffee and sat at his workbench and pulled the current job, a Cessna avionics module with a faulty altitude encoder, toward him, and he started working because the work was always there and the work was always the same, and there was something steadying about that. His mind kept going to the kids, though. The faces. The question of what it would mean to give someone like Deshaun a real path in, not a gesture, not a one-time scholarship, but a structured program with real mentorship and real outcomes. He kept working. At 2:45, he put the job down, locked the shop, and drove to pick up Sophia. She was on time. He was on time. She got in the truck and looked at him with her usual assessment. Normal day? She asked. Getting less normal, Logan said. Sophia buckled her seatbelt. That woman called you this morning. From the airplane place. I heard your voice go different when you answered. Logan looked at her. You were supposed to be eating breakfast. I was eating breakfast and listening. He pulled out of the parking lot. Her name is Vanessa Sterling. She's the one who owns the airplane. What did she want? To talk. About the money? About what to do with it. Sophia was quiet for a moment, watching the road. What are you going to do with it? Logan glanced over at her. Something Grandpa would have liked. Sophia thought about this for a long moment, and then she nodded. The same simple, certain nod she'd given at the diner. The one that didn't need anything added to it. The truck moved down Route 9, past the diner and the dry cleaner and the parking lot of the school already emptying out, past the familiar landmarks of a life that was, at this particular moment, standing at the edge of something it hadn't stood at before. Logan kept his hand steady on the wheel. The few days Vanessa had asked for turned into 5, and Logan spent them the way he spent most things, working, waiting, not talking about it. He finished the Cessna job. He did 2 delivery runs. He replaced a failing fuel flow sensor on a Piper Cherokee that belonged to a retired schoolteacher named Harold, who flew recreationally on weekends and always brought Logan a container of his wife's soup when he came in for service, as if the payment weren't enough and the soup was the real transaction. Logan ate the soup at his workbench on a Thursday afternoon and read through his father's 7th notebook again, not looking for anything specific, just reading. Deshaun came by after school on Wednesday, the way he sometimes did. He was 16, tall, with the careful movements of someone who had learned early to take up less space than he actually occupied. He'd started coming around the shop 8 months ago after Logan had done some work on a community center van, and Deshaun had been there helping unload supplies and had asked, watching Logan run the diagnostic scanner, what the numbers on the screen meant. Logan had explained. Deshaun had asked a follow-up question that was better than the first one. Logan had handed him the scanner. Now Deshaun sat on the stool in the corner and worked through a practice problem Logan had written out for him. A fault tracing exercise, hypothetical aircraft, 3 possible failure points, find the right one using only the data given. He worked quietly, which Logan appreciated. He had his phone face down on the bench beside him, which Logan also appreciated because it meant he'd made a choice to be here rather than elsewhere. After about 20 minutes, Deshaun looked up. It's the fuel control unit. The pressure readings are off by a consistent margin, not variable, which means it's not a sensor error. Why not a sensor error? Because sensor errors are usually inconsistent. They fluctuate. This one doesn't fluctuate, it's just wrong the same amount every time. Correct, Logan said. And what does that tell you about the actual problem? Deshaun thought about it. That the unit is outputting bad data consistently, which means the unit itself is bad, not the thing measuring it. Right. Logan set down the probe he'd been cleaning. Consistent offset error almost always points upstream. The thing doing the measuring is fine. What it's measuring is the problem. Deshaun nodded, writing something in the small notebook he'd started carrying. Logan had not suggested the notebook. He just noticed it one day and had felt something in his chest tighten in a way he hadn't expected. "Can I ask you something?" Deshaun said. "Sure." "There's a summer program, aerospace mechanics. It's 6 weeks. It's at the technical college over in Bridgeview." He paused. "It costs $800. Logan looked at him. "You applied?" "They accepted me." "That's good, Deshaun." "Yeah." He turned the pencil over in his fingers. "My mom said she'd figure it out, but I know what figure it out means. It means she's going to take on extra shifts and not sleep enough, and then blame herself when it doesn't work out." He said it evenly, not looking for sympathy, just stating the math. "I was wondering if there was work I could do here over the summer to offset some of it." Logan was quiet for a moment. He thought about what he could realistically pay for shop labor, which was not much, and whether it would add up to $800, which it would not, and whether there was a version of a lie he could tell Deshaun that would cover the gap without making it obvious he was covering it. He thought about 5 days of silence from Vanessa Sterling. "Let me work on something," Logan said. Deshaun looked at him with the specific wariness of someone who had heard that phrase from adults before and knew what it usually meant. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to. I want to try something. Give me a week." Deshaun held his gaze for a moment, then nodded and looked back down at the notebook. He didn't say thank you, which Logan respected, because the gratitude in the room was already doing its job without being announced. Vanessa called on Friday morning, just before 9. "I have numbers," she said, skipping hello, "and I have a structure. I need you to hear both and tell me if I'm solving the right problem." "Okay." "Not on the phone. Can you come to the Hargrove Center? I'm still there. The aircraft is being prepared for its demonstration flight, and I'm overseeing the final checks." He rearranged the morning schedule, called Harold to push back a follow-up appointment, texted his second delivery contact, found someone to pick up Sophia if the meeting ran long. He drove to Hargrove and arrived at 10 a.m. to find that this time, someone was waiting for him at the service entrance with an actual visitor's badge already made out in his name. He clipped it on. It felt strange, the weight of it. Vanessa met him not in the main hangar, but in a smaller conference room attached to the facility's operations center, a utilitarian space with a whiteboard on one wall and a table that had seen better decades. She had a laptop open and a legal pad full of handwriting and 2 cups of coffee from somewhere that wasn't the facility's break room, which meant she'd had someone go get them. She pushed one toward him. "It's from the place on Route 9. I asked around." Logan sat. "You asked around about where I get coffee." "I asked around about a lot of things this week." She turned the laptop toward him. "Look at this." He looked. It was a document, a program framework, roughly structured with sections for curriculum, facilities, enrollment targets, certification pathways, and budget projections spread across a 3-year horizon. It was not finished. There were placeholder brackets in several places, question marks in the margin in her handwriting, but it was far more developed than anything Logan had sketched in his own head. He read it carefully. She let him, which he appreciated. She didn't narrate it. "The certification pathway section," he said after a while. "You're routing students through FAA Part 65 certification. That's the standard pathway for avionics technicians." "It is, but for younger students starting from scratch, it's a 2-step. You need the airframe and power plant certificate first before you can specialize in avionics. Some of these kids will be 16, 17. The timeline is long. Which means the program needs to start earlier in the educational pipeline than I had it," Vanessa said. "Middle school, ideally. You start with fundamentals, electronics, basic systems, physics, before they ever touch an aircraft. By the time they're 18, they're not starting at 0. Vanessa wrote something on the legal pad. "That changes the budget. More years of instruction, younger students. You need a different kind of instructor, someone who can teach to a 12-year-old without losing the technical depth." "My father did it," Logan said. "He ran a summer program at his base for kids from the surrounding area. Started at 12, 13. He said the ones who started young always had better instincts as technicians because they'd had more years of just playing with systems, getting comfortable with failure, not being afraid to take something apart. How many of those kids went into the field? I know of at least 14 personally, Logan said, and he was doing it on almost no budget. Word of mouth, donated equipment, a parking lot, and a folding table. Vanessa set her pen down. This is the part where I tell you what I've been talking to my board about. Okay? The $1 million is already committed. That's not contingent on anything. You earned it, and even if you hadn't, the offer was public. But what I've been discussing is whether Sterling Aero takes this on as a company initiative rather than a personal donation. A formal workforce development program, run in partnership with you, housed eventually in a dedicated facility, with a 4-year funding commitment and a review at the end to assess outcomes and decide on continuation. She paused. That's a different order of magnitude than $1 million. Logan looked at her. What does Sterling Aero get out of it? Recruitment pipeline, primarily. The industry shortage is real. I wasn't saying that to make you feel better. We have open technician positions we can't fill, and that problem will get worse before it gets better. But also, she stopped. She looked at the legal pad. Also, I think it's the right thing to do. And I've been in a position where I could afford to do it for a while now, and I haven't, and that's bothered me more than I've said to most people. Logan picked up the coffee. It was from the diner on Route 9, and it was better than his shop coffee, which was a low bar. The board approved? The board approved a pilot, 1 location, 2 years, limited scope. If the outcomes justify it, we expand. She looked at him steadily. The pilot is here, in Cloverfield, because that's where you are, and you're the component this program can't function without. He sat with that for a moment. I'm a one-man avionics shop. I'm not a program director. No, but you know what the curriculum should look like, and you know how to teach it, and I can hire the administrative structure around you. She folded her hands on the table. I don't want to run this program, Logan. I want to fund it and support it and make sure it doesn't die because of a budget shortfall. But the person who shapes what it actually is, that needs to be someone who understands what the kids need, not someone who understands what looks good in a grant report. It was the first time she'd used his first name. He wasn't sure she'd noticed. He stared at the laptop screen for a while. The budget projections in the document were numbers he had no real framework for. They existed in a world substantially larger than the world his shop operated in. But the curriculum section, the certification pathway, the timeline, those he understood. Those were his father's world, translated into a spreadsheet. There's a kid, Logan said. 16. He got accepted to an aerospace mechanics summer program at the technical college in Bridgeview. It costs $800, and his family doesn't have it. Vanessa looked at him. He came to my shop 8 months ago and asked what the numbers on a diagnostic scanner meant. He's been coming back every week since. He's got better instincts than most adults I've worked with. Logan paused. He's exactly who this program is for. What's his name? Deshaun. Vanessa picked up her pen. Does he know about any of this? No. I told him I was working on something. I didn't want to promise what I couldn't deliver. Get him the $800. That's straightforward. That comes out of the committed $1 million. She wrote something. And when the pilot program is running, he's in the first cohort. If he wants to be. Logan looked at her. You're moving fast. I've been watching a plane sit broken for 6 days, she said. I don't move slowly when I know the direction. He almost smiled. Is that how you built the company? It's how I've built everything. Sometimes it's a problem. She said it without apparent defensiveness, just as information about herself. I've made some bad decisions fast. I've also gotten things done that would have taken other people a year. What kind of bad decisions? She looked at him with slight surprise, not offended, just registering that he'd asked. The kind that come from trusting your read of someone and being wrong about them. She paused. A former business partner, 7 years ago. I moved fast into a deal because I trusted my instincts about who he was, and it turned out I was seeing who he wanted me to see. She said it evenly, but something in the set of her jaw told Logan it was a thing she'd said few times. It cost the company. We survived it. But I've been careful since then about the difference between moving fast and moving reckless. Which is this? She held his gaze. Fast? I've been careful about you. She said it without apology. I had someone check your business records this week. Your shop's been operating for 6 years, no complaints filed, no licensing issues, 3 industry commendations. You're not known in the industry generally because you're small and in Cloverfield, but the people who know you locally all say the same thing. What do they say? That you do honest work and don't overcharge and that you learn from the best. She paused. One woman said your father would have been proud of how you run the place. She said it like it was the highest compliment she could think of. Logan set down the coffee cup. Something behind his sternum had gone tight in a way he'd learned over the years to breathe through, because it wasn't grief exactly and it wasn't pride exactly, but it was something that lived in the same neighborhood. Who was she? He asked. A woman named Patricia Gunderson. She said she used to work with your father at the base. Logan nodded slowly. He knew Patricia Gunderson. She'd sent flowers to the funeral, and he'd written her a thank you note, and they hadn't spoken since. He made a mental note to call her. So, Vanessa said. She clicked the laptop closed. What do you think? Logan looked at the closed laptop. He looked at the whiteboard, which had someone else's scheduling notes on it from whatever meeting had been in this room before. He looked at the door. He thought about his shop with its cracked counter and its terrible coffee and its framed photo of his father in the desert sun. He thought about what it would mean to do this and what it would mean not to. He thought about Deshawn's notebook. I think, Logan said, we're going to need a real facility. Even for the pilot. You can't run hands-on avionics instruction in a classroom. You need hangar access, actual equipment, aircraft to work on. He paused. And you need the instruction to be structured around failure, not success. Kids need to see systems break and understand why, not just follow a procedure that works. That's how my father taught, and it's the only way it actually goes in. Okay, she was writing. What else? The instructors matter as much as the curriculum. You can have the best program design in the country, and if the people teaching it can't connect with a 15-year-old from a rough neighborhood, you lose the students before you ever see what they could become. He paused. I don't know yet who those instructors are. I'd need to find them. That's a workable problem. What else? The program needs to be free. Not just affordable, hon. Free. The moment you put a cost on it, even a reduced cost, you start filtering out the kids who need it most because those families don't have any amount to spare, and they also don't trust that anything worth having is being offered to them for free, which means you need community trust, not just open enrollment. He looked at her. That takes time. You can't buy it. You have to show up consistently for a while before the community believes you're actually there. Vanessa had stopped writing. She was looking at him with that direct attention. You've thought about this before, she said, for a long time. I just never had the means to do anything about it. And now? He held her gaze. Now I'm talking to someone who might. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, somewhere in the main hangar, there was the sound of machinery. Sterling 1 being made ready. The aircraft that had sat broken for 6 days and now hummed with the particular aliveness of something restored. I need to go walk the final checks, Vanessa said. She closed the legal pad, capped her pen. Come. He followed her out of the conference room, through the corridor, and into Hangar A. The difference from 6 days ago was stark, in a way that was almost physical. The scaffolding was down. The rolling carts and diagnostic terminals were gone. The 30-plus engineers had contracted to a small crew of 6 doing final verification checks with the focused efficiency of people who knew exactly what they were looking for. The aircraft sat clean and complete in the hangar's center, and with the main doors open and the February light coming in flat and cold from the east, Sterling 1 looked the way it was supposed to look, ready. Grady was there, near the nose, with a clipboard. He saw Logan and nodded. Not the tight, barely civil nod from 5 days ago, but a real one, the kind that acknowledged something. Logan nodded back. Departure is tomorrow morning, Vanessa said, standing beside him, looking at the aircraft. Transatlantic demonstration. London, then Dubai, then back. 14 days. Long time to be away. I've been away longer. She paused. There are things about running a company that no one tells you before you start. One of them is that you spend a lot of time in transit, and not enough time in one place long enough to see something through from start to finish. She said it without complaint, more like someone reading from a list of known costs. That's part of why I want the program structured so it doesn't depend on my constant presence. You need to be able to run it without waiting on me. Logan looked at her. I wasn't planning on waiting on anyone. She glanced over at him, and the thing that had been close to a smile earlier came all the way in this time, briefly. Good. Kessler, the German engineer, passed them with a nod to Vanessa and a second look at Logan that was more curious than the one in the hangar on the first day. Logan suspected Kessler had also done some looking into things this week. There's paperwork, Vanessa said, a lot of it. Lawyers, LLC formation, partnership agreements, program governance. I'll have my team send you the initial documents when I'm in the air. She turned to face him directly. You'll need your own lawyer to review them, not Phil from the dry cleaner building. Logan stared at her. How do you know about Phil? I told you. I asked around. She was already moving toward Grady and the clipboard, the particular forward energy of a woman who moves through a room like she's always 10 seconds ahead of it. I can recommend someone if you need. I'll find my own, Logan said. She stopped, looked back at him. Yeah, she said. You probably will. Then she was gone, into the conversation with Grady about departure prep, absorbed back into the machinery of her own world, the way she'd been from the moment he'd seen her walk into the hangar 5 days ago. Logan stood for a while longer, looking at the aircraft. He thought about the first moment he'd seen it from the service road, the stillness of it, the wrongness of something that expensive and that carefully made just sitting there, unable to do the one thing it was built to do. He thought about the log on the diagnostic terminal, the parameter wrong by a margin invisible to 31 engineers who'd been looking in the wrong place. He thought about how many times in his life he'd been the thing sitting still in the wrong place, unable to start, for reasons that someone else might have seen clearly if they'd known where to look. He turned and walked back toward the service entrance, past the fuel vehicles and the equipment carts, out into the February air that was cold and sharp and smelled faintly of jet fuel, the way every airfield always did, the way his father's jacket had smelled when Logan was small, and his father would come home from the base and pick him up without warning, and Logan would bury his face in the collar and breathe. His phone buzzed. A text from Sophia, sent from the school's office tablet because she wasn't allowed a phone yet. Did you eat lunch today? He stood on the tarmac in the cold and typed back, working on it. 3 dots. Then, Dad. He put the phone in his pocket. He got in the truck. He drove to the diner on Route 9 and ordered a sandwich he ate at the counter in 12 minutes, because the day still had work in it, and the work was always the thing that held the shape of everything else. But underneath the ordinary motion of the afternoon, the drive back to the shop, the parts order he needed to finalize, the job waiting on the bench, there was something new and unsteady, like a frequency he hadn't been tuned to before, beginning to hum. The documents arrived 3 days after Sterling 1 lifted off for London, delivered electronically by a lawyer named Carla Reyes at a firm in Boston that Logan had never heard of, and whose website had the particular spare confidence of an operation that didn't need to advertise. The initial package was 63 pages. Logan printed it at the library on Route 4 because his shop printer ran out of ink on page 11, and he sat at one of the reading tables near the back with a highlighter and a notepad and went through it the way his father had taught him to go through technical documentation, slowly, looking not for what the document said it was about, but for what it actually said in the specifics. 3 hours. He flagged 11 sections. He made notes on the notepad in his own cramped handwriting, which was not as good as his father's, but was getting better with age, or at least more consistent. He called the lawyer Vanessa had offered to refer him to, and then because he'd told Vanessa he'd find his own, he didn't call that one. He called a woman named Ruth Ibarra, who had an office above a hardware store in the next town over, and who had done his business filings when he first opened the shop, and who charged reasonable rates and, more importantly, had a quality Logan valued above almost everything else in a professional. She told him what she actually thought rather than what she thought he wanted to hear. Ruth read the documents in 2 days. She called him on the 3rd morning. It's a legitimate agreement, she said. The structure is solid. Sterling Aero gets naming rights on the program, a seat on the advisory board, and access to graduate placement data for their own recruitment reporting. You get operational control, curriculum authority, and the funding in tranches tied to enrollment milestones rather than performance metrics, which is better than I expected. What are the flags? 2. The exit clause on Sterling Aero's side is at 18 months, not 24. If they pull funding after the first year and a half, you don't have enough runway to transition to alternative funding without a gap. Can we negotiate it to 24? I already drafted the language. The second flag is in the intellectual property section. The curriculum you develop becomes a joint asset. If the program ends or the partnership dissolves, the curriculum rights split 50-50. A pause. That's not necessarily bad, but it means if you ever want to run this somewhere else without Sterling Aero, you'd need their sign-off on using your own curriculum. Logan set down the highlighter. That's a problem. I know. I'd push to have curriculum rights stay with you, with a license granted to Sterling Aero for use in affiliated programs. That's a meaningful distinction. Will they agree? Depends on how important you are to this deal. Ruth said it without edge. If they need you more than they need the curriculum, they'll agree. If they think the program can run on autopilot once you build it, they'll hold the IP position. Logan thought about the conference room at Hargrove, about Vanessa telling him the program couldn't function without him. Whether that was true or negotiating strategy, he couldn't fully separate. Probably both, the way most true things had strategy inside them. Push on both, he said. Already done. I sent the red lines to Carla Reyes this morning. He thanked her, hung up, and went back to work. What? The response from Carla Reyes came in 48 hours. They conceded the exit clause, 24 months. On the IP issue, they countered with a compromise. Curriculum rights stayed with Logan, with a 5-year exclusive license to Sterling Aero. After 5 years, Logan could take the curriculum anywhere. Ruth called it a good outcome. Logan thought about it for one evening and then agreed. He signed on a Thursday. The signing was not ceremonial. Ruth emailed him the document. He signed electronically. It went back to Boston. There was no moment. He was at his workbench when he did it, with a ground power unit from a Beechcraft disassembled in front of him, and after he hit send, he set the phone down and picked up the probe and kept working. He texted Vanessa. Signed. She was in Dubai. She replied 40 minutes later, which meant it was past midnight wherever she was. Good. Facility search starts Monday. I'll have someone reach out. Then after a pause, a second message. How's the coffee at the shop? He stared at it. Still terrible, he typed. Her reply was just a single character, a period, which he spent a moment interpreting before deciding it meant she'd registered the information and was already thinking about something else. He put the phone away and went back to the ground power unit. The someone who reached out on Monday was a man named Curtis Webb, a Sterling Aero facilities coordinator based in the regional office 3 hours south. He was 40-something, efficient, with the organized energy of someone who spent his life turning vague directives from executives into concrete actions and had made peace with the fact that the directives were usually underspecified. Curtis came to Cloverfield on Tuesday. He walked the industrial district with Logan, looking at available buildings with hangar-adjacent space, and he had a tablet with a criteria checklist that he kept referencing and Logan kept quietly arguing with. This one's too small, Logan said at the third property, an older warehouse near the freight road. The square footage meets the minimum spec. The spec is wrong. You need space not just for the students and the equipment, but for the equipment to fail, for things to be spread out across a floor and examined wrong and reassembled wrong and figured out over time. Tight space creates tight thinking. He walked the perimeter of the building. And the ceiling height won't work for anything larger than a small single engine. You want the students working on real aircraft eventually, not just components. Curtis wrote something. The budget has parameters. I know, but the whole program has parameters and they're more important than the real estate ones. Curtis looked at him with the expression of a man recalculating. There's a property on the far side of the freight road. It was a regional cargo maintenance facility in the 90s, shut down in 2008. It's been empty since. The county owns it. He scrolled on the tablet. Ceiling is 26 feet. Floor space is roughly 12,000 square feet. Tarmac adjacent, direct taxiway access. Logan looked at him. Why wasn't that the first one? Because it needs significant renovation. The electrical alone would run, show me. The building was not in good shape. That was the honest version. The not honest version was what the county facility manager tried to sell them, which involved words like character and structural soundness, used in specific combination to avoid saying the roof has 2 active leaks and the HVAC is 20 years out of code. Logan walked the floor slowly, which took a while because the floor was 12,000 square feet, and he looked at all of it. He tested the electrical panels. He looked at the ceiling clearance. He checked the taxiway access, which was real and intact and would need resurfacing but could handle a Cessna or a Piper without issue. He stood in the middle of the empty main floor for a while. The light came in gray through the high, dirty windows. The place smelled of old concrete and metal and something faintly mechanical that had seeped into the walls over decades of use. It was not a beautiful building. It was a space that had been used for real work and then abandoned, and it still held the shape of that, the bones of function underneath the decay. He thought about his father running a program on a parking lot with a folding table. "What's the county asking?" Logan said. The facility manager named a number. Curtis made a note. Logan made a different kind of note, which was that the number was lower than he'd expected, which meant the county had been trying to move this property for a while and was not in a position to hold firm. "We'll need 6 months of renovation before it's operational," Curtis said, outside, in the gray February air that hadn't warmed up appreciably since the hangar day. 4, Logan said. "If we prioritize the floor, the electrical, and the HVAC in that order, the roof can be phased. The roof is 2 leaks, neither of which is over the primary work area. I checked. We put collection systems in place during the renovation and fixed the structural issue properly before the first student sets foot in the building, but it doesn't have to be done before we can work on everything else." Curtis studied him. It was a look Logan was starting to recognize, the recalibration that happened when people encountered him and expected one thing and got something else. Curtis had started the morning expecting a small-town shop owner who needed to be guided through a process. He was ending it with something more complicated. "I'll run the revised timeline by the team," Curtis said. "Do that," Logan said. "And I need to walk the tarmac one more time." He went alone. The taxiway access was at the south end of the property, and he stood where it opened onto the freight apron and looked across it. Empty now. Just cracked pavement and dead winter grass at the edges and the flat gray sky above. But in his head, he could already see it differently, the way the building looked in his head differently. Students out here. An actual aircraft, small, older, something donated or purchased used. Young hands on real equipment in real conditions, not simulations, not models. The actual thing, with its actual weight and its actual complexity and its actual tendency to go wrong in ways that mattered. He thought about Deshawn's notebook. He thought about the face Deshawn had made when Logan said, "I'm working on something. Give me a week." The careful, practiced absence of hope that 16-year-old boys from Deshawn's neighborhood learned because hoping for things that didn't arrive was a particular kind of cost they'd learned not to afford. Logan was going to have to talk to Deshawn soon. He'd been waiting until the documents were signed, until something was real enough to report rather than just a direction. It was real now. He pulled out his phone. Not to call Deshawn. Not yet. He called Phil, the bookkeeper above the dry cleaner, and told him the business was going to need a different financial structure going forward, and Phil was going to need to refer him to someone better equipped. And he said it directly so Phil wasn't blindsided, and Phil said he understood and gave Logan the name of a firm in Bridgeview. Then Logan put the phone away and stood on the tarmac for another moment. The sky was starting to do something that might become snow later. He could feel it in the air the way people who'd grown up in this part of the country learned to feel it, the specific density of the cold. He went back to his truck and drove to pick up Sophia. Deshawn came to the shop that Wednesday. He came the way he always did, after school, quietly, checking first through the window whether Logan was with a customer. He wasn't. Logan was at the bench with a wiring harness and a cup of the terrible coffee and one of his father's notebooks open to a page he'd been reading and rereading all morning. Deshawn sat on his stool. He pulled out his own notebook, started in on a practice problem from last week that he'd said he wanted to revisit. He'd gotten the answer right the first time. Logan suspected he was revisiting it because it was a problem he'd liked, the way some people reread passages in books they'd already finished. Logan let him get settled for a few minutes. Then he set down the wiring harness. I need to tell you something, Logan said. Deshaun looked up. His face was neutral, sir, the careful neutral that was doing a lot of work underneath. The summer program at Bridgeview, Logan said. The $800 is covered. Deshaun was still for a moment. You said you were working on something. I worked on it. What does that mean, exactly? Logan had thought about how to say this and had decided the right way was directly, with detail, because Deshaun was 16 and smart and had been on the receiving end of enough vague charitable gestures to be rightly skeptical of them. So he told him. The whole shape of it. Vanessa Sterling, the aircraft, the program concept, the signed agreement, the building on the freight road. He left out the precise dollar figures because that wasn't the point, but he didn't simplify it or soften it or make it sound easier than it had been. Deshaun listened without interrupting. His pen was in his hand, but he wasn't writing. He was just listening, with that attention that Logan had recognized on the first day and kept recognizing. When Logan finished, the shop was quiet. So the program, Deshaun said. How many students? First cohort? We're targeting 12. We'd want to go younger than you, middle school start. But you're in the first cohort regardless, if you want to be. You've already been apprenticing here, informally. We'd formalize it. What does formalize mean? Structured curriculum, actual certification pathway. You'd finish the summer program at Bridgeview and come back here in the fall with the program running, and your experience counts toward your hours. Logan paused. Your goal is your A&P license, airframe and power plant. That takes time and hours, but we build the pathway so you're earning the hours while you're learning. By the time you're 20, you could be licensed. Deshaun set his pen down on the notebook. He looked at the bench. He looked at the wiring harness. He looked at the notebook that had belonged to Logan's father and had been sitting open all morning. My mom's going to ask where the money's coming from, he said, for the summer program. Tell her a company called Sterling Aero started a workforce development fund, and the program at Bridgeview is one of the first grants it made. Logan looked at him steadily. That's true. That's exactly what it is. Deshaun looked at him. Is this because of you? Like, specifically? Some of it. Why? Logan picked up his coffee. Because you asked a good question 8 months ago, and you've been asking better ones ever since. And because someone did something similar for me a long time ago, and I never had a way to pass it on until now. Deshaun was quiet for a moment. Something had shifted in his face. Not the careful neutral. Something else. Something younger and less controlled that was probably closer to what was actually there. He looked back down at his notebook. Okay, he said. Okay, you'll think about it? Okay, I'm in. He picked up his pen. Can I finish this problem? Logan almost laughed. Yeah, go ahead. Vanessa returned from the demonstration tour on a Tuesday, 12 days after departure, and called Logan from what sounded like an airport terminal. The tour went well, she said. London was good. Dubai was complicated. Complicated how? A potential client who said he wanted the jet but actually wanted to renegotiate the whole service contract at the table, which I wasn't there for. I had to leave the dinner early to deal with it. A pause. We kept the client. Did you close the contract? Not yet, but we will. She said it with the flatness of someone certain, rather than someone performing certainty. Curtis briefed me on the facility. You chose the one he said was over budget. It's the right building. I know. He said that too eventually. He also said you knew more about renovation sequencing than he expected. I renovated my shop myself 4 years ago when the back wall was rotting out. I couldn't afford a contractor. A brief silence on the line. You did it yourself. Mostly. My neighbor Marcus helped with the electrical. He's an electrician. Is Marcus available for this project? Logan paused. He hadn't thought about that. I could ask. Ask. Another pause, and Logan could hear in the background the particular ambient noise of a large terminal, the announcements, the motion. I want to come see the building before we finalize the purchase. When? I'm home Thursday. Friday works if you're available. I can be available Friday. Good. She paused. How's the program shaping up on your end, curriculum-wise? I've been outlining the first year. Basic electronics, systems theory, introduction to avionics architecture, then hands-on integration in the second semester, working on actual components. He paused. I want to start every class with a broken thing. Not a lesson about the broken thing, just the thing itself, broken, sitting on the bench. Let the students look at it, form a theory. Then we work through it. Silence for a moment. Your father's method, Vanessa said. Pretty much. It sounds right. She said it not as flattery, but as judgment. I'll see you Friday. She hung up without ceremony, which Logan had come to understand was not rudeness, but efficiency. She said what needed saying and stopped, which was actually a quality he respected because most people kept talking past the end of useful. He put down the phone and looked at the open notebook, his father's page about knowledge shared not diminishing but multiplying. He'd been reading it all week. He wasn't sure he'd stop. Friday was clear and cold, the first genuinely sunny day in 2 weeks, the kind of February morning that felt like an argument for the month existing at all. Logan was at the building before Vanessa, which he'd intended. He wanted to walk it once more before she arrived, see it fresh with the prior week's distance. The leaks were in the northeast corner, as he'd noted. The floor was sound. The ceiling clearance was everything he'd said it was, and in the direct winter light coming through the clerestory windows, the space looked larger and more possible than it had in the gray. Vanessa arrived at 9 sharp, in the same car as before, the same driver waiting outside. She came in alone. She was wearing a different blazer, but the same kind of flannel beneath it, and the same pulled-back hair with the same deliberate carelessness. She walked the floor the way Logan had, slowly, looking at everything, saying almost nothing. She looked up at the ceiling for a long time. 26 feet, she said. Enough for a Cessna 172. If we ever want to get a twin engine in for advanced work, we'd need a bay extension, but that's years out. Not years, she said. We plan for it now in the foundation work, even if we don't build it yet. It costs almost nothing to roughen the supports during renovation. She was already 3 steps ahead. Logan had noticed this was how she operated. She was always building the version after the current one simultaneously, running 2 timelines in parallel. I want to show you something, Logan said. He led her to the south end, through the door to the tarmac, onto the apron. The taxiway access opened in front of them, and beyond it the freight apron, and beyond that the flat gray-white of the winter fields, and above it all the clear cold sky. He let her look at it without narrating. That was how his father had shown him things too. Just put you in front of them and waited. After a moment she said, the first day they go out here, the students. Yeah. What's on the tarmac, first day? An aircraft. He paused. I've been in contact with a man who runs a small flight school an hour south. He has a 1987 Cessna 152 that's been out of service for 4 years. Engine needs a complete overhaul, avionics are dated, airframe has cosmetic damage. He's been meaning to restore it but doesn't have the time. He'd donate it to the program. And the students restore it. That's the goal. Not in the first week, not in the first month. Over the course of the first year, they touch every system, engine, airframe, avionics, everything. At the end of the year, that aircraft flies. She turned and looked at him directly. The sun was at an angle that put it slightly behind her, and she had to shift to look at him without squinting, and it was an ordinary movement, but it made the moment feel suddenly less formal, less like a site visit, and more like 2 people standing on a tarmac in February having a real conversation. The aircraft flies, she said. That's the point. The students don't just learn how a plane works. They make a plane work. There's a difference. He paused. You know there's a difference. She looked at him for a moment. Yeah, she said. I know. They stood there for a few seconds longer than the conversation required. The cold was steady, and the sky was clear, and somewhere over the freight apron, a pair of birds moved in a wide curve and were gone. I have a question, Vanessa said. Okay. When all of this is running, the building, the program, the students, what do you do with the shop? Logan had thought about this. He'd thought about it more than almost anything else in the past 2 weeks, in the small hours when he couldn't sleep. I keep it, he said, scaled back, 2 days a week. The The program runs the other three. He paused. The shop is how I pay the bills while the program is getting established. And it's what I am. It's not something I'm ready to let go of. I wasn't suggesting you let go of it. I know, I just wanted to be clear. She nodded. And Sophia? He looked at her. It was the second time she'd asked about Sophia. Not in a pointed way. There was nothing strategic in how she said it. It sounded like someone who'd genuinely been thinking about the question. She's good, Logan said. She asked me last week if the building was going to have a good bathroom. Vanessa blinked. Then she laughed. A real one, not polished, slightly surprised. The laugh of someone who hadn't been expecting to laugh right at that moment. That's a reasonable question. She's a reasonable person. How old again? 7. Vanessa looked back at the tarmac. Something had shifted in her expression. Softer, not in a way that diminished it, but in a way that added to it. My father never saw any of this, she said. What I built. He died before Sterling Arrow had a name, before we had anything. Just an idea and a rented garage. I know, Logan said. You told me. I don't tell people that usually. He was quiet. I think about what he would have said, she said, about the company, about the aircraft, about... She gestured at the building behind them. This, she paused. I think he would have said it matters more than the aircraft. Logan thought about his own father, about the notebooks, about 87 names he hadn't known until Vanessa found them in a trade journal interview. Yeah, he said, I think mine would have said the same thing. The morning held still for a moment. The cold air and the clear sky and the empty tarmac, and two people standing on the edge of something they hadn't entirely built yet, but could see the shape of, which was maybe the most important part. Then Vanessa turned, practical and forward-moving, the way she always returned to. I'm going to call Curtis on the way back and tell him to proceed with the county on the building purchase. The renovation timeline you gave him, 4 months, I want that as the hard deadline. She was already moving toward the door. And I need the first cohort recruitment plan by the end of the month. 12 students, where they're coming from, who's doing outreach. I have a contact at the middle school, Logan said, following her back inside. And Deshaun knows people at the high school. He can help with peer outreach. Use him. She was crossing the main floor, heels on concrete. And get him the $800 for the summer program this week. Don't make him wait. Already done, Logan said. She stopped walking, turned around. You did it before the agreement was signed? I did it out of my own pocket while I was waiting. I'll file for reimbursement. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he didn't have a clean word for. It wasn't admiration exactly. It was something more like recognition. The look of someone seeing a thing they understand. File it with Curtis, she said. She walked out. Logan stood in the middle of the empty building, 12,000 square feet of cold concrete and possibility, and listened to the sound of her car leaving and then the sound of nothing, and then the small sounds that were always there underneath nothing, the building settling in the cold, the wind finding the places where the seals were worn, the distant mechanical hum of the freight road. He looked up at the ceiling. 26 feet, enough for a Cessna 152 with room to breathe. He pulled out his phone and texted Marcus. I have a job, big one. Electrical overhaul of an old cargo facility. You available? He pocketed the phone and walked the floor one more time, alone, in the winter quiet, already beginning to see what it would be. Marcus said yes. He said it the way Marcus said most things, without drama, with a slight narrowing of the eyes that meant he was already calculating labor and materials in his head before the sentence was even finished. He came by the shop that Saturday morning with his own coffee because he'd had Logan's coffee before and had made his position on it clear some years ago. And he sat on the customer chair and listened to the full scope of the electrical overhaul and then said, I'll need to bring in 2 guys for the panel work, but the wiring runs I can do with you. I'm not a licensed electrician, Logan said. You're also not a licensed anything else you do, and it hasn't stopped you yet. Marcus looked at his coffee cup. I'll supervise the runs. You do the grunt work. It'll go faster, and it'll keep your costs down. A pause. This is the thing with the Sterling woman? Yes. Deshaun's going to be in it? First cohort. Marcus sat with that for a moment. He was a big man with a quiet way of processing things that took up more time than most people's loud ways. His mother know yet? Deshawn told her last week. What'd she say? According to Deshawn, she cried, and then told him to stop making her cry, and then cried some more. Marcus looked out the shop window at the parking lot. Good, he said simply. They started the electrical assessment the following Tuesday. The renovation moved in the grinding, imperfect way that renovations always moved. The roofing contractor found a third leak that Logan had missed, which pushed 2 weeks of interior work, and the county's building inspection turned up a structural issue in the northeast corner that required a steel reinforcement nobody had budgeted for. Curtis fielded the overruns with the resigned efficiency of someone who had learned to expect them, and Logan sent him documentation with the same thoroughness he applied to diagnostic logs, which Curtis mentioned once, with something that might have been appreciation. Vanessa was in New York for most of March, closing the Dubai contract and managing 2 other deals that were either significant or complicated. Logan couldn't always tell from the brief updates she sent, which arrived at irregular hours, and were usually 1 or 2 sentences followed by a question about the building. He answered the questions. He didn't ask about the deals. Sophia made a Valentine's Day card for the airplane lady in February and then became embarrassed by it and hid it in her backpack, and Logan found it 3 weeks later when he was looking for her permission slip for a field trip. He left it on the kitchen table without comment. When he came home that evening, it had been moved to her room and was not mentioned again. April arrived with mud and warmer air, and the first real suggestion that the building could become what Logan saw when he closed his eyes and thought about it. The electrical was done. The HVAC was running. The floor had been resurfaced in the primary work area, not refinished. Logan had specifically asked for texture over smoothness, the kind of surface that would survive dropped tools and oil and years of students learning things the hard way. The ceiling was clean. The lights were industrial and bright and made the 12,000 square feet look like what it was supposed to be. Curtis walked it with Logan on a Thursday and made a list of remaining items, and Logan made a different list, and they reconciled the 2 lists over a coffee at the diner on Route 9, which had become, without either of them planning it, the default location for project meetings because Logan was always close to it and because the coffee was better than the shops. The county is going to do a ceremony, Curtis said, for the building. The program launch. They want to make it a thing. What kind of thing? Ribbon cutting, local press. County commissioner will want to speak. Logan looked at his coffee. Does it have to be a thing? The county gave you a significant discount on that building because you agreed to a workforce development use clause. In exchange, they get to be publicly associated with a good news story. Curtis said it without apology. That's the deal. I know. Logan paused. I just want the focus to be on the students, not on you, or Vanessa, or the money angle. The story that gets told about this program in the beginning shapes what people think it is. If the first story is Billionaire saves struggling town, the program becomes about that. I need it to be about the kids. Curtis studied him. You should say that to her. I will. He called Vanessa that evening. She answered on the 2nd ring, which was unusual. She usually answered on the 4th or 5th, in the way of someone managing multiple things simultaneously who had to finish a thought before they could fully arrive. The county wants a launch ceremony, Logan said. Curtis told me. I think we should do it. I do too. I just want to talk about how we frame it. A pause. You don't want it to be about the money. I don't want it to be about either of us. I want the first 12 students standing in front of that building and the story being about them. She was quiet for a moment. That's going to be hard to sell to the county commissioner. He'll want the Sterling Arrow angle. He can have it. I'm not asking to hide anything. I'm asking that when the cameras point somewhere, they point at 12 kids who got into an aviation program, not at a businessman and a billionaire who set it up. Another pause, longer. Okay, she said. Okay that easily. I don't need the press, Logan. I have enough of it. She said it not bitterly, but factually, the way she usually stated things about herself. What I need is for this program to actually work. And if it works, the story takes care of itself. A pause. Besides, you're right. I'll remember you said that. Don't make a thing of it. He almost smiled. He was getting better at catching the moments when she was doing the version of a joke that didn't announce itself as one. The recruitment had been running since March, handled primarily by Logan, with help from a school counselor at the middle school named Ms. Farrow, who had, within 20 minutes of Logan's first visit to explain the program, become its most effective advocate. She had the instinct for which kids were exactly the right fit. Not the ones who declared immediate enthusiasm, but the ones who went quiet and interested when Logan talked about how aircraft systems worked, who asked the second and third question after the first. By April, they had 19 applicants for 12 spots. Logan and Ms. Farrow and a retired avionics instructor named Philip Okafor, who Logan had found through a professional contact and recruited as the program's lead instructor, a decision he'd made in the first conversation when Philip had said, unprompted, "The most important thing you can teach a student is how to be wrong productively." Sat in Ms. Farrow's office on 2 consecutive evenings and went through the applications. It was harder than Logan had expected, not because the decisions were unclear, but because they were too clear, which was a different kind of difficult. He knew what he was looking for. Not grades, not test scores, but the particular combination of patience and curiosity that showed up in how students described their thinking process, not just their answers. He found it in 12 applications and not in 7. And setting the 7 aside meant looking at 7 specific kids who had applied for a real reason and were going to hear no. And he sat with that for longer than was strictly necessary. "We'll expand in year 2, Philip said. "I know. The 7 who don't get in this year get priority consideration next year if they reapply." "I know that too." Logan set down the last application. "It doesn't make it easy." "No," Philip said. "But easy isn't the job." Logan looked at him. Philip Okafor was 61, had spent 30 years in military aviation before retiring and teaching at a technical college for a decade, and then, as he described it, getting bored of the curriculum and deciding to find something that wasn't bored yet. He was precise and direct and had the quality Logan had been hoping for most in an instructor. He talked to students as if they were capable, which meant he held them to a standard and didn't apologize for it. "You're going to be good at this," Logan said. Philip raised an eyebrow. "Was that ever in question?" "On my end? No. On yours. You told me in our first conversation you weren't sure you wanted to run a program for middle schoolers." "I said I wasn't sure 12-year-olds would have the patience for systems work." Philip paused. "I've since reconsidered. The ones without patience wash out. The ones with it," he tapped the stack of applications. "The ones with it are exactly what we want." The launch was set for the second Saturday in May. The building was ready. Not perfect. There was still a section of the west wall that needed paint, and the bathroom that Sophia had inquired about in January had taken until April to be properly completed. But the primary work area was ready, the equipment was installed, the workbenches were solid and real, and bore the particular smell of new metal and clean concrete that made Logan feel, the first time he stood in the finished space, like something his father had written in a notebook had somehow been translated into physical form. The Cessna 152 arrived 3 days before the ceremony, trucked up from the flight school an hour south on a flatbed, and when the transport crew rolled it off and onto the apron, Logan stood in the open doorway of the building and watched it, and felt the particular weight of the moment without trying to name it. The aircraft was rough. The cosmetic damage was more visible in person than in the photos, and the engine compartment looked like something that had been argued with and lost. But it was real. It was an actual aircraft, with actual systems, that had actual hours on it, and had once actually flown, and it was now sitting on the tarmac waiting for 12 students who hadn't yet arrived to start the long work of understanding it. He walked out to it. He put his hand on the cowling. The metal was cold from the transport. "She's seen better days." He turned. Vanessa was standing at the building door. She'd arrived that morning. He'd known she was coming. She'd said she'd be there for the ceremony, but he hadn't heard her pull up. "All the best ones have," Logan said. She crossed the apron to where he was standing. She looked at the aircraft the way she'd looked at Sterling 1 in the hangar, with attention, with the engineering eye that evaluated and didn't romanticize. "The engine's a full overhaul. Everything. New cylinders, new magnetos, rebuilt carb. It'll take the students most of the year, but the parts are sourced." He patted the cowling. Philip's already mapped the instructional sequence. They start with the airframe, visual inspection, structural assessment, learning what damage looks like and how to classify it. Then systems, electrical, fuel, controls. Engine last, because the engine is the reward. Vanessa was quiet for a moment. What happens when they finish? The aircraft gets inspected and certified. If it passes, and it will, because Philip doesn't let things leave his program that don't pass, we find a local flight instructor to take the students on their first flight in an aircraft they rebuilt themselves. She looked at him. That's what you said the goal was. First day at the facility, on the tarmac. Yeah. You've been building toward that one moment for a year. Everything builds toward something, Logan said. The question is whether the thing you're building toward is worth it. She looked at the aircraft for another moment and didn't say anything, which Logan had come to understand was how she responded to things that landed solidly. She got quieter, not louder. The morning of the ceremony was cool and clear, the kind of May Day that apologized for February by being better than it needed to be. The county commissioner gave a speech that was longer than Logan would have chosen, but included a genuine acknowledgement of the students that Logan suspected Ms. Farrow had coached into him. A local TV crew was there, and a reporter from the regional paper, and a number of parents who stood at the edge of the gathering with the particular watchful expression of people who hadn't fully let themselves believe in something yet, and were seeing for the first time that it might be real. Logan didn't give a speech. He'd thought about it and decided against it for reasons he couldn't entirely articulate. Something about the difference between making something and talking about making it, and how the second one often diminished the first. Vanessa spoke briefly, which she did well because she was precise and didn't over-explain things, and stopped when she was done. What Logan did instead was stand with the 12 students in front of the building while a photographer from the county took pictures, and then walked them inside and let them see the space for the first time. He watched their faces. Some of them went immediately to the workbenches, wanting to touch the equipment. A girl named Amara, 12 years old and the smallest in the cohort, went to the window that looked out onto the apron and stood there looking at the Cessna for a long time without moving. A boy named Jordan, who had written in his application about wanting to understand why his grandfather's crop duster had crashed 3 years ago, stood in the middle of the floor with his hands in his pockets and looked at the ceiling. And Logan recognized what was on his face because he'd worn it himself, at 11, in a maintenance hangar with his father. The specific expression of someone who has just walked into the place they were supposed to be and is still adjusting to the reality of it. Deshaun was there too, standing with the cohort, though as the oldest and the one who'd been coming to the shop for 8 months. He occupied a slightly different position in the room. Not quite an instructor, not quite a peer, something in between that Logan thought might evolve into something useful as the program grew. Philip Okafor stood at the front of the space and waited for the room to settle. When it did, he said, "Look around you. This is not a classroom. A classroom is a place where you learn the answer to a question someone already knows. This is a place where you find the answer to a question nobody's answered yet for this specific problem in front of you." He paused. "The aircraft on that tarmac does not work. Your job is to make it work. Not because I tell you how. Because you figure out how. I will guide you. I will correct you when you're wrong, but I will never fix it for you. Understood?" 12 students in a room that smelled of clean concrete and new metal, all of them looking at a man who was not speaking to them like children. "Yes, sir," said Deshaun, and the others followed. Logan stood in the back of the room and did not speak. He drove home in the early afternoon, after the ceremony crowd had cleared and the students had left with their parents and Philip had done his own quiet walk of the building, checking everything the way Logan had learned to recognize as Philip's version of comfort, not inspecting for problems, just orienting himself, the way an aircraft does a ground check before it commits to the air. The shop was quiet when Logan stopped in. He didn't have work scheduled. He'd cleared the day, but he stopped anyway, the way he always stopped. Because the shop was the shape of his life before any of this, and he was not ready to stop returning to it. He sat at his workbench. He opened his father's 7th notebook to the page about knowledge shared. He read it. Then he read it again. He thought about the way his father had said things, not in speeches, not in declarations, but in the middle of work, while both of them were doing something with their hands, almost as if the important part wasn't the words, but the fact that the words were accompanied by work, like ideas needed the weight of something physical to survive. He thought about what the past 3 months had been: the documents, the negotiations, the building, the renovation, the 12 applications he'd sat with for 2 evenings and couldn't stop thinking about. He thought about the moment on the tarmac in February when he and Vanessa had stood looking at the freight apron and the conversation had shifted from the operational to the personal without either of them planning it. He thought about Deshawn's notebook, the practice problems, the way a 16-year-old who had learned not to hope for things had looked at him across a workbench and said simply, "I'm in." He thought about a value wrong by a margin invisible to 31 engineers. How close things come to not happening. How a delivery run on a cold February morning, 12 minutes of schedule cushion, a truck that needed new shocks. How thin the thread is between the moment just before something changes and the moment after. His phone buzzed. A text from Vanessa. "How are the students?" He looked at the message for a moment. He typed back, "Exactly what they should be. You should have seen their faces. 3 dots. Then, "I did. I was watching from the back." He hadn't seen her standing there. He looked at his phone and thought about that. About her standing in the back of the room, watching 12 kids hear Philip Okafor tell them the aircraft didn't work, and their job was to fix it, and choosing not to make herself known, just watching. He typed, "Why didn't you say anything?" Her reply took a moment. "It wasn't my moment." He sat with that. "No," he typed back, "but thank you for being in it." A longer pause this time. Then, "Your father would have been proud of today." Logan set the phone down on the bench. He looked at the notebook. He looked at the photograph of his father on the wall. The desert, the C-130, the squinting not smile of a man who didn't perform for cameras but was entirely at ease with what he'd built in his life, the visible and the invisible both. He sat for a while. Then he picked up the phone and called Sophia's school to confirm the pickup, because it was almost time and because some things don't change no matter what else does, and those things are often the most important ones. Deshawn finished the summer program at Bridgeview in August and came back with a certificate and a piece of knowledge he hadn't been able to articulate before. That he was genuinely good at this, not just interested in it. There's a difference between the two that most people don't discover about themselves until they're in a real environment doing real work, and Deshawn had discovered it at 17, which was young enough to build something substantial on top of. He started the fall term as part of the program's first cohort, and as an informal assistant to Philip. Not officially, nothing was formalized, but Philip was perceptive enough to recognize that Deshawn's presence in the room changed how the younger students engaged, because Deshawn was close enough to their age and their world to translate in ways that Philip, for all his skill, couldn't. Philip mentioned it to Logan once, briefly, and Logan said he'd noticed too, and they left it there because the thing was working, and they were both experienced enough to know not to over-explain the things that work. Amara, the girl who had stood at the window looking at the Cessna on the first day, turned out to have a specific talent for electrical systems that Philip called, privately, one of the best instincts he'd seen in a student in 20 years. She could trace a fault through a wiring harness by reading the diagnostic log, the way Logan had been trained to read them, without anyone teaching her the specific method. She'd derived it herself from the underlying logic. Logan found out about this not from Philip, but from Deshawn, who told him on a Wednesday afternoon at the shop with the particular matter-of-fact delivery of someone reporting an obvious fact. Amara figured out the harness problem today before Philip got through the first hint. Logan said, "How?" She said she just held still and listened. Deshawn paused. Her words. Logan looked out the shop window. "Your words first," Deshawn said. "My father's words first," Logan said. Done. In October, Sterling Aero's annual industry report included a section on the Cloverfield Aviation Institute, the name the program had settled on after a long conversation between Logan and the county in which Logan had pushed for something that belonged to the place rather than to the company, and the county had agreed because it was their place too. The section was brief, factual, included enrollment numbers and projected certification outcomes. It did not mention Logan by name in the main text, which was what he'd asked for. Vanessa had called him when the report was published. You realize not having your name in it doesn't make you less responsible for it, she said. I know. It just means you don't get the credit. That was the point. Most people who deserve credit want it. Most people, Logan said. She made the sound she sometimes made. Not quite a sigh, not quite a laugh. Something in between that meant she was reassessing something and wasn't quite ready to say what. I want to come in November, see where the Cessna project is. Philip says they'll have the airframe assessment done and be starting the electrical systems work by then. I want to see that. And I want to, She stopped. What? I want to see the building when it's being used. Not at a ceremony, not on a site visit, just in the middle of an ordinary day. Logan thought about that. You could just show up. I didn't want to show up without saying I was going to. Why not? A pause. Because it's your program. I'm a funder and a partner, but I don't want to walk in like I own it. He was quiet for a moment. You can walk in whenever you want. You don't need to announce it. He paused. And for what it's worth, it's not my program either. It's Philip's and the students' program. I just built the room and found the broken thing, she said, which is actually the most important part. Anyone can build a room. Not anyone can find the thing that's been wrong for 6 days while everyone else looks in the wrong place. He didn't have a good answer for that. He said, come in November. I'll tell Philip. Tell him I'll stay out of the way. He'll appreciate that. She came on a Tuesday in early November. She'd mentioned the date once and then hadn't mentioned it again, and Logan hadn't reminded her, and she arrived in the middle of a regular instruction day at 10 in the morning and stood in the back of the work area in a jacket and boots with her hands in her pockets and watched. Philip was running an electrical fault tracing exercise, a deliberate fault he'd introduced into a wiring harness, asking students to find it using only the diagnostic equipment and the log. It was, Logan recognized, a version of the exercise he'd been running with Deshawn for nearly a year. Philip had adapted it for a classroom of 12. The students were at their workbenches in pairs, working through the problem with the focused tension of people who wanted to find the answer before the other pairs did, which was a dynamic Philip had deliberately cultivated, and which Logan thought was probably his father's dynamic too, just never stated explicitly. Amara and her partner found the fault first. She presented her reasoning to Philip in the clipped, precise way she'd developed. Not showy, just thorough, each step explained in the order it happened. Philip asked 2 follow-up questions. She answered both. He nodded. Vanessa watched all of this from the back of the room without speaking. Afterward, when the students had moved to the apron for the second hour of the day, working on the Cessna's control surface inspection under Philip's supervision, Vanessa stayed in the building with Logan. Amara, she said. Yeah. How old is she? 12? 13 in January? Vanessa looked at the door to the apron. She's going to be remarkable. She already is, Logan paused. The remarkable part is that she'd have been remarkable somewhere else too, if she'd had a path in. That's the thing. The talent was never the question. The path was the question. Vanessa turned and looked at him. She had the direct expression she always had, but something in it was different in the ordinary Tuesday light of a building that was doing what it was built to do. Less guarded, maybe. Less the expression of someone managing a situation. You said once that knowledge shared doesn't diminish, she said. You didn't say it to me. I read it. In a piece about your father. Logan looked at her. That was his line. I know, but you've spent the last year proving it. She paused. 1 parameter in a startup file. That's where all of this started. 1 wrong value, Logan said. 400 milliseconds instead of 280. And you saw it from a doorway. I saw the pattern from the doorway. The specific thing took 5 minutes. She almost smiled. You always make it sound like it was nothing. It was one thing I knew and happened to use at the right moment. He looked out the window at the apron, at the 12 students around the Cessna, at Philip moving among them like something slow and deliberate and reliable. What matters is that it led to all of this. Whether I deserve credit for the original thing or not, this is what it became. And this, he paused, this is worth a lot more than the $1 million. Vanessa was quiet for a moment. Then she said, The board approved Year 3 funding last week. I was going to tell you in a call, but she gestured around the building. Here is better. Logan looked at her. Year 3. We're only in month 5. The outcomes data from the first cohort was better than projected. Philip's report was... She paused. Compelling is an understatement. The board saw numbers they hadn't expected to see this early. A pause. And I made the case that you don't abandon a program that's working because 2 years is up. You expand it. Expand it how? A second cohort next year starting at the same age, and a conversation about a second location, not Cloverfield, somewhere else that needs a pipeline. I want your input on where. He looked at her. He thought about other Deshawns, other Amaras, in other towns with other empty buildings that used to be something and could be something again. There are a lot of places, he said. I know. That's why I need your input. She held his gaze. You know what to look for. I know how to fund it. That's a long partnership, Logan said. Yes, she said. It is. The word hung in the air with more weight than a simple agreement. Logan was aware of it, and so, he thought, was she. And neither of them did anything with it except let it be what it was, which was honest. Home. December came early that year, the cold arriving before the calendar confirmed it, and Logan found himself one evening sitting on the floor of Sophia's room, helping her with a school project about careers, which required her to interview someone who did interesting work. She had chosen Philip Okafor. This was not entirely a surprise. Sophia had met Philip twice at the building and had declared him, in the unpredictable logic of 7-year-olds, the most serious person I've ever met, except for you, Dad, but in a different way. Philip had been amused by this and had told her, with complete seriousness, that he'd take it as a compliment. Logan helped her write the interview questions and then stayed out of the way while she asked them over the phone, crouched on her bed with a notebook that was pink and had a cartoon astronaut on the cover. Philip answered every question with the same precision he applied to everything, adjusted slightly for the age of the questioner, which meant he was direct and honest without being blunt. Logan listened from the doorway. At the end, Sophia said, "What's the most important thing you teach the students?" Philip considered. That the machine will tell you what's wrong with it, if you hold still and listen. A pause. That's not originally my line. I borrowed it from someone. Sophia wrote it down. Logan watched her write it down in her pink notebook, in her uneven 7-year-old handwriting. His father's line. In a child's handwriting, in a notebook with a cartoon astronaut on the cover. He went to make dinner and let her finish, and the kitchen was quiet and warm and smelled like the soup he was heating up. The same soup Harold's wife made, because Harold had kept bringing containers of it, and Logan had finally asked for the recipe, which Harold had given him with the pleased expression of a man whose wife's soup was being requested. And the ordinary sounds of the evening moved through the house, and Logan stood at the stove and felt something he didn't have a clean word for either. Not happiness exactly. Not satisfaction. Something larger and quieter than both of those. The feeling of a thing being what it was supposed to be, not because everything had gone perfectly, because nothing had gone perfectly, but because the direction had been right from the beginning, and the direction had held. His phone was on the counter. He picked it up and opened a text to Vanessa. He typed, "Sophia interviewed Philip tonight for a school project." He hesitated, then typed, "He used my father's line." She wrote it down. He sent it and put the phone back and stirred the soup. The reply came while he was setting the table. "That's the whole point, isn't it? Not a question. Just a statement from someone who understood exactly what he meant without requiring the explanation." He put the phone in his pocket and called Sophia for dinner. She came down the stairs still holding the pink notebook because she wasn't done with her questions yet and had more she wanted to ask Logan, and she sat across the table from him and set the notebook beside her bowl and looked at him with the directness she'd had since she was old enough to look at anyone directly. "Dad," she said. "Yeah." Philip said, "You're the reason the whole thing started." "Philip and I see it differently." "He said you'd say that." She picked up her spoon. "He said that's also part of why it works." Logan looked at his daughter across a kitchen table on a December evening, with soup from a retired schoolteacher's wife's recipe and a pink notebook with a cartoon astronaut and 12 kids learning to find broken things on a tarmac in Cloverfield, and he thought about a February morning and a truck that needed new shocks and a timing parameter wrong by 120 milliseconds. How close everything had been to not happening. How strange and stubborn and irreversible it was that it had. "Eat your soup," he said. Sophia ate her soup. Outside, the first real snow of December was beginning to fall. Quietly, without announcement, the way the most important things usually arrive.